Hey, folks, welcome back to another episode of Health and Tech with Amanda Nystrom. We are in the Managing Stress series, which all of us have. Go ahead and take a look at the first episode, which was an introduction to telomeres, which is not a Scientology cult. It is an actual DNA thing that was researched by a Nobel Prize winner. Amanda, what are we talking about when we talk about stress today?
Love your description of what you automatically think of when it comes to telomeres.
It's it sounds like either that or when they described, I forget what it's called. Star Wars fans will be really mad at me, but the spiritual biome things that give them the force, right? They're telomeres. I don't. But it's an actual. This is actually real life stuff, folks. The telomeres allow you to either drastically shrink or prolong your life, depending on how you respond to stress. So, Amanda, why don't you give us a little bit on what we're talking about today?
Today, we are going to dive into the different types of stress. So, keeping it big picture still, not necessarily jumping into the whole how exactly do you manage stress, because that answer is not global. That answer is individual, but it is important for all of us to understand the big picture of stress before we do that.
And when we're talking about types of stress, we're not talking about the teenage daughter and her new boyfriend. We're talking about something a little bit more specific.
Yeah, so we're talking about really how the brain works and your amygdala, the part of the brain that takes in and processes emotions and what's going on around you. That is where you're going to encounter things like stress first off. And it's going to either throw you into something like fight or flight, or you're going to play the nice dance of trying to woo yourself around it so it doesn't throw you into fight or flight. But why this is relevant to stress is because our systems really, really like strong emotion, and they like stress because it's a strong emotion often.
So, rage bait
Um,
titles in social media.
it, I'm not going into that. Um, but where that comes from is that we have actually two types of stress or two ways of interpreting stress in the brain. One is threat based, which is kind of what you mentioned. It's when things are going to affect us deep down, and it feels like I can't do it, right? That it sends you into the fight or flight response. And then there is challenge-based stress, which is the funny way of saying the good stress that people encourage you to lean toward.
Now, hold on. When we first spoke about this, I thought it was threat versus identity.
No, identity is part of threat.
Okay. Okay.
So to get into that a little bit early, one of the things that threat-based stress comes off as is that we associate our identity with our performance in something. Say it's keeping our systems nice and clean and very performant and doing exactly what they need to do and not having any bugs and all of that.
So,
Um,
probiotics.
but if they have an issue, it's almost like we take it personally and it affects who we are. It's, I am not safe anymore because this system is not operating how I designed it to.
Okay. And
Does that make
then,
sense?
yes. And then the challenge base, what's that?
Challenge based stress is when you come upon a stress or stress happens to you, and your response is essentially, I can overcome this. Or what can I gain from this? Basically, hitting something head on and trying to get the most out of it,
Solving a problem.
solving a problem in a productive way.
Okay. So, eh, and challenge-based stress, you said that's the good stress,
That is the good stress.
right? So, which is good because otherwise my whole life has been a lie. Um, the Well, I like to solve problems, right, and overcome challenges. Uh, talk to us about, so if that's the good stress, what is the issue with the bad stress? How does it affect us, and why is it so important to manage?
So, the bad stress and the important piece of this episode is that it's not, I shouldn't say bad stress, it's threat based stress. It, over time, will shorten your telomeres and therefore affect not only your disease span, but your lifespan. And it will make you more inclined for things like inflammation and autoimmune conditions and any number of things where you basically your system is weakened. And that's threat-based stress because it triggers your fight or flight. It's funny how this all is connected, right? But when you are in a threat-based uh, situation, all of the blood like loses it leaves your limbs and goes to your core. Your digestion slows down, which affects your microbiome. You don't think logically, you don't think about the whole picture, you think about what's right in front of you, usually like just yes or no answers. And a lot of this a lot of us are high functioning threat based stress people,
Okay,
right? We've learned
yeah, hold on a second. I'm gonna do the Netflix where you gotta give people, like, what's going on in every episode. So in the first episode of this series, we talked about telomeres. Can you give us the 15-second on what a telomere is?
It is the end cap to your chromosome that keeps your cells from deteriorating.
And you identified that as directly applying to our lifespan, which I'm sure every listener understands. But what about disease span? What is that?
Our disease span is the length of time that we spend more susceptible to disease. So if you look at a standard lifespan, usually it doesn't start until I think the 60s, 70s range, and then it's the end of your life. If you have shorter telomeres and your cells deteriorate faster because they don't have that strong end cap, basically, your disease span starts earlier in life and lasts the rest of your life.
Okay. So you said that a lot of us, if not all of us, are chronic threat-based stress responders. What does that mean exactly? I mean, I mean, I know, but let's talk about how the environment of what we're dealing with here, why it's so important.
The key word that I use there is high functioning because it's not good for us, right? But it's something that we have learned how our body responds to and how to work with it so we can get more done before our system shuts down, right? We are not designed to be in threat mode all the time. We're not designed for the level of stress that we have to deal with all the demands of being on all the time, whether we're on call with our company, whether it's just we're in marketing and we need to respond to those emails all the time, whether we're managing a database 24/7, or if we're a parent, right? I mean, some of those things we're designed to do, but in today's world, we're doing them all the time. So we're always on, and it turns us into basically we're constantly mitigating stress, and that turns into threat based because it's so much that we can't manage.
So, as this is managing stress, and we have threat based and challenge based. We've already determined challenge based is it's the fun stress, right? A problem has presented itself. You have an opportunity to productively solve that problem and have a return on investment for that stress. Threat based stress, you're basically killing yourself for no reason. So how do we, I mean, I don't want to be flippant because the answer is simple, right? But it was kinda like we have some dear friends who live a very simple life, but simple does not equate to easy,
Hmm,
right? So
very
while
true.
the answer is simple, the solution is not easy, right? Implementing the answer or getting to the answer, I guess, right? So, what do you recommend as a first step?
One of the things that I go into on the Wellness OS is the simple act of interrupting and redirect. It's actually a coaching method when somebody is going off on a tangent or they're just sharing and sharing and sharing. Well, when it comes to our threat-based stress, um, starting to ask those questions that interrupt the process. So if you notice, for example, you're going on a negative tangent, like something did not go the way that you expected. Like last week when we tried to record, nothing was working. My Bluetooth kept disconnecting, just all of the things. And
I
you
almost
get
went
really,
Amish,
really
I swear to God. It's just
all of the
ridiculous.
stress, right? It throws you into fight or flight. Um, Interrupting that process. And it's really a simple process of I am encountering a ton of negative emotions or negative feelings, or I'm angry, or I know that those are synonymous, but sometimes people's negative emotions are shame based. And so it's not necessarily anger. Um, so interrupting the negativity and bringing awareness to it, just saying, I feel angry, and then redirecting. Going back to the original task, or
So,
um this is not necessarily science-based when it comes to this specific book. This is something that I've learned through my own experience.
sure, and I think that, I mean, it's not unlike, if you're getting mad, count to 3, right? Take a deep breath, those types of things. Those are all, proven tools depending on who you are. Um, you know, Threat-based stress, though, from my experience, is almost entirely environmental. Um, and as an example, a lot of folks, and I know that you said you didn't want to get into this, but it's just directly applicable to either people in tech or people that use tech, social media, right? The type of people, and when I say social media, I'm not talking about just Instagram and TikTok, right? I'm not talking about mental masturbation. I'm talking about social media as a whole, and that includes New York Times, Wall Street Journal. It doesn't matter what you're reading, Vanity Fair, Vogue. Um, if you are consuming either victim level mentality information or negative mentality information, that is what you're going to feel. And therefore, environmentally, it's going to trigger your challenge, not your challenge, your threat response, right? So, how do people? I mean, I understand the interrupt and redirect or reframe, but how do we encourage people, especially in our world, right, which is very deeply technical? How do we encourage people to have that awareness?
Watch a health and tech podcast.
Sure, that is that's valid.
There's a couple of things that came to mind when you said that. And the first one is it's hard to answer the question, how do you encourage someone to have awareness? Well, often it's bringing up the realistic question that I think you touched on a moment ago of, if this is your life right now and you make no changes, where are you going to be at in 5 to 10 years? Are you going to increase your disease span or shorten it? Right? And so it's bringing validity to the all of the stress that we're facing and how it's impacting us on a level that we don't even realize. I mean, we have people that we know that will commonly say the statement, I'll sleep when I'm dead. And I used to believe that, but
Yeah, but we don't sleep
it's,
anyway, so
but it's that kind of mindset that it's why burnout is a commonplace thing now, right? And so knowing just that we having the awareness that this is not sustainable and that we are debilitating ourselves from the inside out. And it may not show up to you today, but it will show up sooner or later. And we all have the power to be able to have a great long life. I mean, for the most part, as long as we bring attention to it and that awareness now.
Well, and we should be clear. I mean, telomeres are not the only aspect here. Generalized genetics, which, now that we're talking about telomeres, perhaps that's why my grandmother, who was a smoker for 30 years, lived till 90, right? And her father did the same thing, 93. So obviously there's a genetic contingent there, which probably meant longer telomeres. But what I think one of the challenges we're going to have with this series, especially with who our target is that we're dealing with very intelligent people, right? Generally speaking, if you're in this field and you're remotely successful, you are very intelligent and probably on the spectrum of autism. But the intelligent part is what we're dealing with here. So how do we convince these, we have someone who's very close to us who makes gobs of money in this industry, um, who's killing himself because he wants to have generational wealth. So what is it? How do you convince someone like that that it really is important to take a step back and that how do we do that? How do we increase the level of awareness and importance to this topic?
Well, to go back to one of your most recent talks, and the Wellness OS is one baby step at a time. And the reason that you do one baby step at a time is because if you do one big step, if you say, I'm changing my lifestyle, my health, and all of that, your fight or flight will go off, and therefore your system will not it'll fill you with anxiety. It's a whole sciencey thing that I've recently got way too nerdy about. But your system cannot sustain major changes. It can only really sustain little tiny changes. James Clear, Atomic Habits, highly recommend. But you know, JD, I can't answer that really because every person is different. And in order to really know what motivates someone, you have to sit down with them and you have to figure out their values and what's most important. Um, but what I will say when it comes to telomeres and when it comes to the different types of stress, the first thing that I would say is that usually threat-based stress, the stress that does limit our lifespan, is tied into our identity. And like we sort of went into, if I do this, then I will be accepted, right? I was reading Brothers on Three, which is a book about basketball in Montana, a true story. And the last chapter, it was the state championships and the way that the coach was reframing all of their stress and anxiety before they went on the court was to say, have fun.
Hmm.
Think of this as a
Good
challenge.
coach.
Because
Good
if
coach.
you don't, if they go in there with that threat-based stress that this is gonna affect their college dreams, that it's gonna affect, the rest of their life, and that people are gonna be ashamed because 'cause they're representing, their culture, and if you go in with all of that weight on your shoulders, your anxiety goes so far up that you can't actually perform. And that is a very real thing. It's one of the things that goes off in this book. So if you take identity out of it, if you remember that regardless of how this turns out, you are worth just as much. And yeah, the thing may not turn into this big dream being fulfilled and blah, 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 but you still have worth and you are still important. And what you bring to the table is still important, and all of your mistakes don't define you. I mean, that awareness will enable you to be so much better at whatever you're doing, because there's suddenly room for boundaries, for protecting your peace, for grace, and for self-compassion, which are really, really important when you are trying to change from threat-based stress to challenge-based.
Okay, so as we wrap this up, and being is of a certain generation, which is X, greatest generation. Um, I have a practical, technical engineer applicable type recommendation. If you are over 40 and you work with people that are under 30 and you are working the same amount of time, you're doing it wrong. And what I mean by that is no over 40 should be working 16-hour days. Now, I'm not suggesting that under 30 should work 16-hour days. What I'm saying is that an under 30 working 16-hour days is still figuring it out. If you're over 40 and you're working 16-hour days, you haven't figured it out and you are shortening your life. With that, this has been another Health in Tech. This is the Managing Stress series with Amanda Nystrom.